My guest at this time has represented WWE in several high-profile legal cases for decades. It is Jerry McDevitt. Jerry, thank you very much for giving me some of your time.
Nice to be with you, Nick.
Well, before we get into this very interesting CTE case and your dealings with a man named Kairos, Constantine Kairos, his name already sounds like a wrestler's name, by the way. I'd be interested to hear, Jerry, like, what's your background with wrestling? When did you get into the business, and like, how did you get hooked up with WWE?
I started with him back in 1987. I was doing basic commercial work at the law firm I'm with here in Pittsburgh, and one of their wrestlers, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, who was at that time part of the Hart Foundation with Bret Hart, was flying into Pittsburgh to do an event up at the Civic Arena in Pittsburgh. Him and Bret were then the tag team champs of the WWE, which I didn't know at the time because I really didn't follow wrestling that much at that point in my life.
Sure.
And at the end of the flight, Jim got arrested by the FBI and charged with interference with a flight crew, with the allegation being that he had gotten in a fight with one of the flight attendants in a dispute over drinks during the flight.
Oh, my God.
And charged with a federal felony of interference with a flight crew.
Oh.
And I had been at that point working on a case out in Colorado with the lawyer who was then representing the WWE. We were working on a case oddly involving air pollution control devices out in Colorado together, and his name was Ted Dinsmore. Ted called me that night and asked me if I would represent Neidhart, which I said, sure, well, I'll be glad to represent him.
Yeah.
And did represent him and got him acquitted of all charges and brought a malicious prosecution case thereafter and got him a lot of money for his trouble. And that's how I met Vince and Linda, and the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, it is. And so, I think it's really interesting. I've been reading up on you before we chatted here today, and I've seen Vince say some very nice things about you. A resource that cannot, a resource that cannot be replaced, I think was one of the quotes. What is your relationship like with Vince? What's it like to be like friendly with Vince McMahon?
Well, it's an interesting thing, Nick. Someday I always kid him I'm going to write a book if I ever get done doing all these legal cases and have time to write a book. But the first words Vince ever said to me when I met him personally was, "I hate lawyers." And and I think I said something to him along the lines of, "Well, I don't really like them all that much either, Vince," which is true. I don't.
Yeah.
And now, it's not that uncommon when we have a conversation, 30, 40 years later now, at the end of the conversation to say, I love you, Jerry. And I love him too. I mean, that's what happens when you go through 40 years of the kind of ordeals that he and the company have had to go through to do what they do. It's just been an amazing journey. And so we're very close. It's not your normal lawyer-client relationship anymore. It's more like family.
Wow, that's incredible. And, before we get one last thing before we get to the CTE case here, everybody seems to have like a funny Vince McMahon story. When you think about Vince, is there like a particular fond memory or something enjoyable that comes to mind that you'd like to share with everyone, or are those personal thoughts you'd like to keep to yourself?
No, you have a ton of them. I have some personal thoughts of them. I have some funny thoughts of them. The thing that I remember most about Vince was back in the late 80s, early 90s, when the feds were investigating the company, and the New York Post was writing a lot of really bad articles about the company that just were full of lies and untruths and things of that nature, and portraying the company in just a terrible light. And I was up there on that day, and I was still at that point getting to know Vince. I didn't know him as well as I do now, so as a lawyer, you're always kind of gauging the people you represent as to whether they're worth the effort it takes to actually do this.
Yeah.
And so we had this meeting in his office, and it was just a horrible day. It was front page stories in the New York Post that were terrible about the company and that he loved so passionately and whatnot. And so he came out of the office. It was late at night. I was sort of walking ahead of him, and as I came out the door of his office, I saw Nick, the janitor, sort of mopping the halls, and said hi to him, and just nodded my head, and was walking ahead, and Vince came out, and the janitor got all puffed up and said, "Hey, Vince, how you doing?" And Vince stopped in his tracks and went over and put his arm around Nick and was talking to him and asking him how he was doing, how his family was and whatnot. And I'm watching this whole scene and I'm thinking, well, you know, that takes a pretty incredible guy to be able to put aside all his personal issues that came up today with the terrible publicity and all the rest of that, to take time to talk to the janitor and ask, you know, how he was doing with his family and whatnot. And I found out later, Nick, that Nick apparently had some kidney issue that made him, it was almost impossible for him to do his job without a dialysis machine. And they had apparently, the McMahons had apparently bought a dialysis machine for him so he could continue his job as janitor.
Wow.
And I thought, you know, that's pretty remarkable that he did that. And I just thought at that point, this is a very interesting guy.
Yeah.
And then one of the funnier stories, you know, there's a ton of funny stories with Vince, but one with, you know, at one point in time, Jesse Ventura had gotten a rather large verdict at the time against the company for, I think, $1 million back around the same time as the criminal trial was going on back in the early 90s, before I was representing them in civil cases. And so I'm handling this criminal case, and Jesse gets this $1 million verdict against him. There's some lawyer, I can't remember his name anymore.
Sure.
David Olson, that's his name. And so after the criminal trial was over, Olson thought he was going to turn this into, I guess, bringing a lot of these kind of lawsuits and cash in a couple different times. So he brought one on behalf of Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. And so Olson's now taking depositions of Vince, and I'm representing him now. And the day before, he had taken Linda's deposition to find out what she knew about the case and whatnot. So Olson starts off the deposition with Vince, and when Vince goes into a deposition, it's kind of funny because he doesn't do the normal stuff people do where, you know, the lawyers usually put their hand out to shake hands and whatnot. And he's very honest. He says, "Look, I'm not here to be your friend. You sued me. I'm not going to shake your hand. Why would I shake your hand? You sued me. I'm not." Which is very honest, because why would you?
Yeah, it's true.
And
yeah,
and he's chomping on these Tic Tacs at the time, like they're nails or whatnot. And so Olson says to him, "Well, Mr. McMahon, are you aware that your wife gave a deposition yesterday?" And Vince goes, "Yes," and he's chomping on these Tic Tacs. And then Olson says, "And did she talk to you or tell you anything about the deposition?" And Vince goes, "Yes, she did," and he's chomping on the Tic Tacs. And Olson goes, "Well, what did she tell you?" And Vince says, "She said you look like a ferret." and he keeps chomping on these Tic Tacs, you know. And Olson goes, "Well, I should have expected something like that from you, Mr. McMahon, you know." And Vince goes, "Hey, listen, you told me I had to tell the truth. I took an oath to tell the truth. You asked me what she said. That's what she said. You look like a ferret." You know? And I mean, he was never the same the rest of the deposition. We ended up winning the case on summary judgment, and he went away. But you know, there's a million of those kind of stories I could tell you. He's just a hoot to work with.
Oh my God! All right, that's great. Thank you for those stories. Wonderful. I always love good vid stories.